Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about interview questions. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, when a senior professional at a FANG-like company designs interview questions, how do they ensure or how does the company verify that the questions are appropriate for the limited time available, especially when applied at scale? Well, it depends a little bit. I mean, companies do this in different ways and so forth. So honestly, if you're talking about coding challenges like LeetCode or Caddies or something like that, that's one sort of thing, right? And I can't really speak all that much for those sorts of questions. And usually the way you do it is that you come up with a coding challenge, if it is a coding challenge, and you sort of roughly evaluate how long it would take yourself to do that. And that's pretty much the whole story. There are absolutely companies who do this in a more serious fashion where, they design questions and things like that, and then they have a lot of people run those questions for themselves, and then they get an average time estimate of how long it usually takes. It's not special. This is not specific in any way to software development. The companies who evaluate for all kinds of different types of aptitude tests do very similar sorts of things. But if you were to ask me how I usually do it, if, as I said, if it is a coding related thing, as I said, usually I have a fairly good feel for, I'd like to think, roughly what type of coding challenges to present and so forth. The other one that I also focus on is the personal interview, the questions that I would ask in such an interview. And that there I have a different sort of strategy, which is to, well, one of the first things I usually give as advice to developers who are going to do their first interview or the whatever interview, right, when it comes to a personal interview and where you're trying to assess the seniority of an individual, is to first and foremost avoid open questions or questions that can, as you were describing, take a lot of time because you have a time limit. And so you have to, one part, be sort of graceful enough and confident enough to interrupt a person who might go on a really long rant or describe things in great details. But it's also helpful if you know how to pose questions where the answer range is fairly limited. So those two together makes it so that you can keep track of how long you're spending on each question and stuff like that. And something that I've warned people about a lot is that you really have to do this fairly well, because the problem is that if you, for example, ask one of the worst questions that you can ask is, what is your greatest strength? Or what are you most proud about in your career? That, depending on the person, can take the whole whatever hours you might have. They can talk forever about that, in theory. Some people are like that. And so when you ask that question, you should also ask yourself, what is it that you are getting into return? Because your goal with the interview is to get as much information about the experiences of the person as possible. So if you burn the whole time budget on the first question, and it's a loose question that doesn't even really give you anything concrete in terms of depending on what you're hiring for. So let's say you're hiring a software developer. If you ask them what their greatest strength is, in theory, they could talk for the whole hour without ever mentioning what coding they're doing or what type of coding style or like libraries or frameworks or whatever they've been doing, like what type of applications they have developed, right? They can keep it a really, really high level. And I see that quite often. And so the way that I try to do this in order to mitigate that problem is that I I take a look at the development process that I have within the team that I'm hiring for. So for example, if we take front end, usually I have questions related to general HTML stuff, general JavaScript stuff, general things such as in depending on the framework you're using, some very basic questions there, and a little bit about testing and TypeScript and things like that. And I did mention CSS, I hope. The different areas of what you usually have to touch and be involved in as a front-end developer. For back-end developers, it's a similar sort of beast where you might have questions related to polymorphism, the specific language, what is the MVC pad, and like what type of databases are you familiar with, and do you know what the difference is between one or the other, and things like that. You create these different areas, and then you create a few questions that ideally should be fairly specific. So the way I try to, my philosophy is very simple. My philosophy is that I want to ask a question that can be answered at any level, and then I listen for the depth. So to give you a very concrete example of how that might work is, for example, if we take JavaScript, can you explain have you worked with promises before, and do you sort of know why we have promises and why we need them? Now, you could be a fresh graduate who has literally taken your first course in JavaScript, and I guess standard answer, honest to God, guys, the most common answer I get to that question is, well, promises is this thing we get after we've used the fetch function. That is the standard answer for quite a lot of people. And for those of you who might be completely new, that might be a perfectly valid answer. For the people who might be more in tune to like what promises are and what asynchronous programming is about, they kind of go, yeah, that is what we're getting for it, but it's not really what a promise is. You can create promises in many ways. It's not just a fetch function. And then you have the really nerdy people among us that might say that, well, yeah, promises have a lot of similarities to certain monadic structure, I can think it's a continuation monad. It's not completely a monad, so don't quote me on that. But, and then for example, that JavaScript is single-threaded, and that ties into the event loop. And the reason we have promises is because we don't have threading, and if we don't have that, then so far you can sort of build on it as much as you want. Like, that's the beautiful, I argue, the beauty of that sort of question, because what I'm interested in is to give the candidate a very specific question that I know is experience-based. Because if they've never done anything related to a promise before, they won't be able to answer it. And that's, I just move on, then I go to the next thing. But if they're a junior and they don't really know all that much, they're going to give a very shallow answer. As I said, like, promises is the thing you get when you use fetch, right? Or Axios or whatever you're using, right? And that is, it's technically not incorrect, but it does tell me of your understanding of what this concept is. And then of course you have the people who really know their stuff or go more and more into it, and then you can sort of burrow down until you're satisfied that they have a completely solid understanding of this topic. I do the same thing with, say, like a backend developers is one of my favorite is, could you sort of explain to me how you think about composition over inheritance, and when do you use one or the other? Again, you could answer that in so many ways. And technically, it doesn't matter if you are a junior or a senior, but when you're listening in on you're creating a concrete conversation topic that has a limited, well, it's not something that you could, in theory you could, right? That's why you have to sort of balance things here, right? But overall, that is a very directed question related to something that is very, very relevant usually at the very least for the work that you're doing in your own team. And it is completely possible to answer that at a junior level all the way up to like a master level programmer and so forth. And usually I just use them as conversation starters. If I hear that the candidates usually just nail these simple questions and they immediately give me good, really deep answers on everything, I might scale it up and like use more advanced questions. But my tip to you guys, and this is just my personal flavor, of course, what I try to avoid is that if I hear that their answer, as I said, like a fetch, promises is a thing you get from fetch, right? And that is the whole level of their understanding. Then there's no meaning in like pushing them and saying, well, yeah, but you don't know about the event loop, and like you start going and sort of trying to make them feel bad over that they don't have that depth of understanding. Because your goal in an interview is, I argue at the very least, to assess their skill level, not to make them feel bad over that they don't know the answer to things that you might know, and so forth and so forth. And that's why I try to pose these sorts of questions where they can't really, well, they cannot know, of course, and that's not fun for anybody, and you try to be nice about it, but at the very least you give them a question that they could answer regardless of their profile, and it will give you the opportunity to figure out just how well do they know this specific topic. So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I dial in roughly how much time I need to ask a lot of questions is that I look at the sort of profile I'm looking for. So if I have a full stack developer, I have a certain set of questions, and as you can imagine, it's front end plus back end questions. And if I have one or the other, I use one or the other. So in my world, usually it takes twice as long to test a full stack developer, because I am the sort of guy who goes, I don't care if you say you're full stack, then I expect you to know both exactly the same. or rather like you should know both to a very like to a really like good degree. There's no like, oh yeah, you're a little bit of front end and mostly back end, then you are a back end developer who has taken some basic courses, because I'm going to give you the same questions and I'm going to evaluate the same way. So what I usually do in those sorts of situations, I say, yeah, this is a back end developer who has like junior level knowledge of front end. But if it's just one or the other, I usually split it up that way. And then I usually look at what the teams are working with, the tools and practices and stuff like that they're working with. Some of it is of course generic to everyday software development, as I said, databases and stuff like that. But I try to focus on the actual work tasks and the concept that they will need to know in order to sort of work in a code base. And I try to avoid these really open-ended, like really large questions, because as I said, you can lose the whole interview on a question like that. So make sure that your social skills are up to snuff, so that you can politely ask people like to continue to the next question or things like that. Create a well-rounded set of questions with various areas, because as you can imagine, some people might know a lot about say front end. Some people are like really good at JavaScript or React or Angular or something like that, but they're really light on CSS. So like try to balance it out a little bit, because you're not always or very rarely going to find someone who is like solid across the board. So you have to do like a holistic evaluation. Even if they're weak in one thing, they might be stronger in another thing. And then my personal suggestion is try to create questions that can be answered regardless of skill level, and try to listen to what depth of understanding does the person have of that specific topic, because that will usually help you make sure that you can ask a lot of questions and touch on all the areas that you need for your specific role and company and stuff like that. And it is a very nice way of avoiding that situation where you might have people who they don't really know, and like they get anxieties and stress and stuff like that. Or you might have people who just never actually answers anything concrete about any of your questions, because they're the sort of people who, they don't really know how to code, but they're really good at talking. So they keep all these high level conversations and never go into anything concrete about the work or like these specific topics, because they don't really know that stuff. And by doing this, you basically allow yourself to always keep a focus on the actual task that they're going to perform, which is usually the most important part when you're hiring software developers. And you will always be able to gracefully get a graceful answer back from the person without forcing them to feel like they're stupid because they don't know a very complicated topic or something like that. Because every topic that you start off with is in of itself pretty simple, but if you really get down to it, it can be very complicated as well. Some questions can be, as I said, answered by a junior and you get one answer, and some of them are going to be like super complicated senior level stuff, even though it's the same question. Have a great day.